Right, hello and welcome to another seminar in the series organised by HAV, the Centre for Higher Adults and Vocational Education. I'm Julio Gimenez, I'm a member of the Centre and I'll be chairing the session. Before we start, I would like to say a few words about our speaker, Professor John Halford. John is the Robert Pearce Chair in Adult Education and the Director of the Centre. He's joint editor of the International Journal of Lifelong Education and a member of the editorial board of various journals like the Adult Education Quarterly, the Canadian Journal for the Study of Adult Education and Learning Communities. His research has focused on the role of lifelong education in the formation of citizens, communities and social movements. And his current research interests are in adult learning of citizenship, especially in Europe, in the history of adult education and citizenship in Britain, areas in which he has published widely. His talk today is what does theory explain about the European Union's lifelong learning policies. Over to you, John.
Okay, well, first of all, I should say thank you for inviting me, but since I think I invited myself, perhaps that's or had my arm twisted, perhaps that's not an appropriate comment. This is my handout, or my principal handout, and I'll be going through it. I don't want you, as they say, to look carefully at the handout, because you'll see it all on the screen, and it will help me if you can't if you don't get there before I do. But let me explain a little bit. What I've been doing research on recently, as Julio explained, among other things, is the policies on lifelong learning from the European Union. And one of the things that we were trying to do when we set up this series of seminars was to try to talk about, amongst other things, the role of theory in research. So that's where the theory comes. I think it's probably fair to say that I don't regard myself as a theorist, principally, but I hope I'll be able to say something useful about how theory has sort of informed or underpinned or something the way in which I've gone through the research. And I thought I'd begin by putting out what is a sort of sketch map of what I'm going to say. So I'm going to begin with a personal bit of where I'm going to talk about a little bit about the kinds of topics and theories I'm interested in, and to some extent the ones I know about and how I got interested in them, and in particular how I got interested in the European Union. I'm going to say a bit then after that about lifelong learning and how it sits in international policy. Then I'm going to say a bit about how lifelong learning sits in European Union policy. Then I'm going to say a bit about neoliberalism as an explanation for the things that are happening in lifelong learning and European Union policy, and say something, as I see it, about the strengths and weaknesses of that particular theoretical approach. And then I'm going to say something, some bits about other theoretical perspectives and what they have to offer, and I hope along the way I'll explain how it is that I got into the position that I got to. Julio, you're the timekeeper. I'm a very bad timekeeper, so if I get it wrong, don't feel embarrassed about telling me I'm being prolix or whatever the word is. Okay. So I thought I'd begin with a bit of sort of autobiographical stuff and to explain where it is that I'm coming from, both in terms of practice, and then in the next slide in terms of my theoretical perspectives. My background is very much in adult community and trade union education. I began my career, my professional career, as an adult educator doing trade union education. I then went to work in a university extramural department, and then subsequently came into educational research. However, before well, I'll come on to the other bits for later, but so I'm very much, if you like, I've begun my career doing things, if I can put it this way, sort of on the shop floor, in the place where practice takes place. But then I came into academia, well, into a more research-oriented job in academia in the late 1990s, mid-1990s. And after a while, floundering around thinking, what am I going to do research on, I put in a bid, or one of the bids that I put in turned out to be successful. And this was a bid under the European Union's fifth framework on, well, you can see the title there, Education and Training for Governance and Active Citizenship in Europe. And then it had a long subtitle, anyway, Analysis of Adult Learning and blah, 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 Educational Intervention Strategies in Non-Formal, Formal and Informal Education. And really it was, I suppose, an accident of history that I happened to get funding out of the EU, and as a result of that got involved with European Union stuff. If I hadn't got that funding, I don't think it would have happened. But the one result of that, and there were several, was that I got involved in as what the European Union is pleased to call experts. They invite experts to do things, and I got invited to be an expert for DG EAC, which is the Directorate General for Education and Culture, and is basically the bit of the European Commission that looks after education and lifelong learning. And I mean, there were several different things of this, but one of them, which took about two to 3 years, was what they called a network on active citizenship for democracy. This, as you can see, was in 2006, 2008. And what we were trying to do in that was to create indicators of active citizenship. That is, indicators, ways of measuring the extent to which there is or isn't active citizenship in the different countries of Europe, in order, as it says up there, to evaluate policy implementation for the Lisbon 2010 goals. Well, I'll come on to the Lisbon goals. Does anybody know about the Lisbon goals? One or two of you. Okay, I'll come on to the Lisbon goals presently then. And so on. And the idea is that these indicators were to be used in the European Commission's progress reports on policies relating to active citizenship and education for active citizenship. And then subsequently to that, I got involved in, or actually at the same time, I got involved in some Framework 6 projects, one of which I put up there towards a lifelong learning society in Europe, the contribution of the education system, which had where we did, well, I did quite a lot of work on lifelong learning policy in Europe. So in terms of practice, my entry into the European Union territory, or my interest in the European Union territory, is sort of accidental. But it has it sparked off, I suppose, quite a lot of interest in this thing called Europe, and how it works and what's going on there and what influence it has and so on. So anyway, that's where I'm coming from in terms of practice. I thought I'd say something about where I'm coming from in terms of theory. I couldn't think about, I tried to think of ways of explaining this, but I thought, oh, right, I'll start from my PhD. So here's my PhD. It doesn't come off the shelf very often, I'll pass it around. I'll pass it around. Yeah.
Shall we skim it?
I think if you read it in detail, that's fine. It dates, as Hugh will notice, as you'll notice, from before the days of word processors. So that kind of puts one in one's dotage. I think puts me in my dotage. But as
carbon paper, no doubt.
Oh no, it was in the days of photocopiers. We had got to photocopiers by
yes,
those days. Yes. So what it was was a historical study of the development of labour. It was in, I suppose, it's an empirical study, very much a historical study, but it used political sociology, drawing on people like Marx and Gramsci and Michael Mann and C. Wright Mills, looking at things to do with what Gramsci calls contradictory consciousness and the way in which language affects the way people think and the way social movements develop and so on. It looked at the sociology of organisations, particularly using theories particularly from Weber and Tom Burns in particular, also Alan Fox, looking at the way in which changing structures of industry and structures of union organisation shaped the way in which people thought about what was possible, and shaped the way in which labour was organised and so on. Oh, sorry. So, yeah, it was largely based on working class organisations' records. So I spent a great deal of time looking at the minutes of trade unions and stuff like that. But what I think, so I don't want to tell you in detail about that. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is, look, that in a sense, look, that's quite on the face of it, that's quite a long way from this interest in the EU, which came sort of 20 odd years later. But in some way, I think it's got some similarity. Well, there are some connections in my mind, at least, because all the time through that, I've had this interest in the motivation or ideology. I couldn't think of a better word of what. There's an Indian journal called Subaltern Studies, which tries to look at Indian history from the perspective of through a sort of Gramscian perspective, in terms of Gramsci's notion of hegemony, and I think that's I'm interested in the motivation, ideas, and organisation of social movements, but the reality of my life at least, and the reality of most lives of subaltern social movements is that they tend to fail. And so I spent a lot of time interested in those.
A subaltern, it was a junior officer.
Yeah, well, that's the origins, but it became that's the origin. But in the Gramscian sense, this refers to subaltern classes are dominated classes, and therefore the less powerful classes in social classes. Anyway, so that's where I was coming from in theory. And if I can give this quote, which is a famous quote for any social historian, this is from E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, and in a sense it describes my sort of, not my theoretical perspective, but my ideological position, as it were, in looking at in the kind of studies I do, and not only in the historical sense, but also in the contemporary sense. And I hope that some of that will begin to come clear from what I have to say from here on. Okay, so now we get to the real stuff, as it were. You've been lifelong learning, the bread and butter of my life. Got to change course here mentally. I have to. If you look at lifelong learning and as how it's evolved in international policy, the typical way in which it's written about is to talk about two phases of debate about lifelong learning, two phases of lifelong learning. The first was around those three reports, particularly the second one, Learning to Be, the Fall report, which came out from UNESCO in 1972. And then, in a sense, the international policy making in lifelong learning went rather quiet until the 1990s, at which point we suddenly get a re-emphasis, so it's over 20 years later, suddenly a reawakening of the language of lifelong learning, the notion that learning and education have to be lifelong. And there are two or three key international reports at that stage, which I put up there. One of which you'll see is the European Commission's white paper, Teaching and Learning Towards a Learning Society. And the second is another UNESCO report from Delors, for the Delors report. And Delors, as we shall come on to later, was of course prior to doing this report for UNESCO, he had been the president of the European Commission. So he's a French politician, but who was, as it were, wheeled in to do his influential stuff for UNESCO. But he's very much got connections with the European Union. So we've got two phases in lifelong learning. And if we look at what happened between those phases, these are kind of commonly thought about in this way. And I'm quoting here from John Field, who, if you happen to be in my territory, is a very prominent writer on lifelong learning. He said that the Fore Report is basically a humanistic document. It's all about, well, quotes, the fulfilment of man through flexible organisation of the stages of education, widening access, recognition of informal and non-formal learning, etc., etc., etc. But he says that, look, when lifelong learning re-emerged in the 1990s, in this second phase, as it were, of lifelong learning, the policy papers took a much more strongly economic orientation. That's to say, they're much more strongly oriented towards things like competitiveness, economic change. You know, if we don't change, I mean, a lot of it is if we don't change regularly ourselves, we'll get out of date and we won't be employable. That logic is also applied to societies. If you don't keep your skills up to date, your whole country will go to the dogs, and so on. And this was quite criticised within the lifelong learning community. So this is there's a quote there from Roger Boscher, who describes lifelong learning as human resource development in drag, and he has a whole kind of thing where he basically says, look, they use the language of lifelong learning, but they've actually, as it were, cut out the whole of its real deep meaning and I don't know what the word is, filleted it into something. I've lost my place now. Filleted it. Well, now, how? Yeah, okay. If you look at the European Union, so changing now from the worldwide, as it were, policy on lifelong learning to the European Union's policies on lifelong learning, you'll find the same economistic approach is taken by the EU, broadly speaking. And the EU is clearly a major player in international lifelong learning policy. And some people have, people, when they have explained this, they have taken the dominant explanation as globalization, neoliberal globalization. And I've quoted there two authors on this, one Jackie Bryan and John Field. They say, look, what really drove the European lifelong learning policy was not, or where you can find the origins of European policy on lifelong learning, is actually not in this white paper on education, Teaching and Learning Towards the Learning Society of 1995, but you'll find in that, but a year earlier, or 18 months earlier, in Growth, Competitiveness and Employment, the competitiveness white paper of about 18 months earlier, which says preparation for life in tomorrow's world can't be satisfied by once and for all acquisition of knowledge. All measures must therefore be lifelong learning. And so they're saying, look, lifelong learning policy in the EU is driven by this economic and employment policy, and the economic and employment policy is about competitiveness and the need to respond to international competition and so forth and so on. And the argument here is that this is all about, this is very much a sort of neoliberal globalized argument. And so what do we mean by neoliberalism? Well, I'm not, I guess we've all come across neoliberalism if we haven't experienced it, but I've taken a definition from the Journal of Economic Policy, Journal of Educational Policy here, Olson and Peters. It's a particular element of globalization, the form through which domestic and global economic relations are structured, a politically imposed discourse, and then from Birchall, under neoliberalism, oh, I seem to have got that slide wrong, under neoliberalism, Anyway, I clearly wrote this too quickly. The rational principle for regulating and limiting governmental activity is artificially arranged or contrived forms of free entrepreneurial and competitive conduct. So this is the world of in areas which are public sector areas, we have to invent ways of making people believe that they're doing things in quasi-markets, and so on. So neoliberalism is, as it were, according to Olson and Peters, the political project which sits behind globalization and drives the kinds of changes which are taking place in Western societies. And I put at the bottom, often used in connection with the theory of governmentality drawn out of Foucault. And I won't say a great deal more about that, except that you might notice that it sort of underlies some of my comments in the next few minutes. But I was unhappy with that account. I didn't like it. It seemed to me too simple, because it seemed to me to not really separate out policy rhetoric from the outcomes of policy. In other words, this is the world in which policy research is done by looking at the policy documents and saying, well, if that's what the policy documents said, that's what must have happened. And it seems to me that isn't quite, there's not, obviously policy documents are of significance, but they're only part of the story. It seemed to me, in a strange way, to disempower people who are already disempowered. In other words, we know that that neoliberalism is an important, dominant political force of our time. We know that globalization is a dominant reality of our time, and we know that it's as it were dead hard to contest these. But why do we only focus on the people who've actually been successful in the kind of current world? Why do we not sometimes look at the people who contested it, albeit not altogether successfully? It seemed to me to ignore a kind of body of theory from sociology and political science. I mean, I should say there should be a kind of footnote here, an asterisk here, which is along the lines of, I'm simplifying this rather excessively. There are other points which could be made and so on, but nevertheless. It seemed to me to ignore those, and in particular it seemed to me not to bring out sufficiently the kind of ways in which policy is contested, policy takes place through organisations are sites of conflict, and in particular in international organisations, they can't just impose their views, they have to work through national governments, and there's a lot of toing and froing there, a lot of argy-bargying and negotiation and so on and so forth. And it also seemed to me that it sort of rather lost sight of what I think of as the European social model, or rather what used to be thought of as the European social model. That is that Europe was about social welfare and cohesion and so on and so forth. Okay, so I was unhappy with that account. On the other hand, it seems that, and at this point I'm beginning to kind of, or I'm trying to bring slightly to the surface the question of theory, and I'm trying to think of neoliberalism as a sort of theoretical construct, and tried to say, well, what might neoliberalism explain about lifelong learning policy? Because actually, although I'm unhappy with it, it's not the case that it doesn't actually tell us anything useful. And these are examples of the kinds of things it did seem to explain. It seemed to explain reasonably well part of at least why the European Union had adopted an economistic version of lifelong learning. And the general answer it would provide would be that this was part of a global trend of policy, part of the global trend of capitalism of the present time. It says some useful things, it seems to me, or some people working in this tradition have said some useful things about how the EU has framed its policy documents. And I put up one example there, which I think is quite revealing, where Jackie Brine has shown that I can't actually read this very clearly. I hope you can see it more clearly than I can. Where that shows that there's a real consistency in the way in which European Union documents talk about the knowledge economy and the knowledge society. You know, you might thought these were random use. This was random. Say one minute and one the next minute. But she, working through these documents, came up with the conclusion that actually knowledge economy is always in the policy literature, the EU policy literature, related to highly knowledge skilled learners, so graduates and postgraduates, whereas knowledge society is always linked to the low knowledge skilled learners, the people who are likely to be excluded or indeed in some situations, she says, constructed as the risk, that is, they're the excluded and therefore they might be the risk to social order and that kind of stuff. So that seems to me a kind of interesting thing that this kind of theory shows. And then there's the question of why the European Union has developed indicators and benchmarks and things like the European qualifications framework. Well, and here, for those of you who haven't encountered the Lisbon process before, perhaps I'd better just explain the Lisbon. What did I do on a slide? No, I'd better explain the Lisbon process. Back in 2000, did I say this? Have I said this in somewhere in this?
Is that anything to do with the Lisbon Treaty?
Yeah, no. Actually, that's even more confusing. No, it isn't. I do actually mention it right towards the end, but I'd better say it now. The Lisbon process was set up at the Lisbon Council of the European Union in the year 2000. And it set up a number of targets and objectives for the European Union across the whole areas of policy, which the European Union as a whole should get to and individual countries should try to get to. It also was linked to something which they called the open method of coordination in policy making. The open method of coordination, or OMC, is a system or process whereby the targets would be, on the one hand, reached by consensus through a policy-making consensus of the different countries, not only countries but also stakeholders. But also, it's a system which was going to be measured. It was going to be full of measures of various kinds, indicators. So quantitative indicators of what progress had been made, and benchmarks. Benchmarks was, as it were, targets. So by the year 2010, the average participation of, for example, the average participation of adults between 25 and 64 in lifelong learning was to be, I think, 15% of the population. And we could then measure how well we were achieving that. So we get that's a mechanism of policy making and policy measurement. And in terms of neoliberal policy, that becomes very much, or neoliberal theory, that becomes very much a technology of governance. It's a way in which the neoliberal state attempts to control society and the bits of society in order to meet these objectives. And one can see how this theory works to some extent, because the fact is that we all now leap to the world of indicators and measurements and so on. We see that moves through a whole range of society, and it's not too difficult, in fact, to look at areas of, for example, national government policy, such as British government policy in education, where, although the British government isn't inclined publicly to say we are doing this because the European Union says so, in reality it is moving in the direction that the European Union is prodding it. And it's doing that partly because every year the British government has to report to the EU on its progress in relation to the various targets and indicators and so on, and where it's got to. So it seemed to me that there's an explanation there through neoliberalism, it seemed that there's also quite an interesting argument which is made by Roger Dale and Susan Robertson in this book, Globalisation and Europeanisation in Europe, about why the EU is projecting its policies internationally. And they're really arguing, quite interestingly, I'm not sure entirely convincingly, but certainly it's a very interesting argument, that the European Union is using things like the Bologna process, European qualifications framework and so on, as a mechanism of soft power in order to bring other countries into line with systems which it's then in a position to, as it were, to deliver to. So it's, for example, the Bologna process, it's bringing other countries into line with European higher education systems, and therefore European higher education is more likely to be able to compete in the world market, because the world market will, as it were, look like and treat European higher education more as the, I don't know, the gold standard or something. It's quite an interesting argument. But, so there are lots of things which this kind of neoliberal approach, and I'm using that as a kind of strange label, seems to do. But then it didn't seem to explain a number of things. And I've just put up some as examples here, but I'm sure there are others. So in what ways does the European Union's lifelong learning policy differ from other advanced states? Does the fact that it's the European Union itself, with all this kind of strange political systems going on inside it, have any effect on the nature of policy? And related to that, what's the impact of all this enlargement that's been going on with the EU? I mean, if you go back 15 years, the EU consisted of about 12 countries. It's now 27. Its population has gone up more or less 60 or 70%. The new, so the whole kind of nature of the EU has changed. How's that affected its government, its lifelong learning policy making processes? What potential is there for the EU to develop different approaches to lifelong learning? So, in a sense, does it simply adopt something which fits every country regardless, or is there some way of developing a separate or distinctive, at least, European Union approach? There's a historical question. How can we account for the economistic orientation of European Union lifelong learning policies before we came into what we now regard as the era of globalization and neoliberalism? So if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, you'll find that the European Union policies on education and lifelong learning are not dissimilar in their emphasis on competitiveness and so on. Is there opposition to neoliberalism, and if so, what kind of strategies might succeed? And indeed, what other explanations of what's happening in the EU might there be, and how can we evaluate them? Okay, so at this point, I thought I'd come up with some theories and questions. No, sorry, this is it's not this point I thought I'd talk about some sort of approaches that I began to think about, some areas of theory that I began to use. And this is, when I say began, this is stuff that's developed in various ways and various times over the last sort of 7 or 8 years. And one was to think in terms of theories of path dependency, which is drawing on sort of political science and economics, which is, I mean, put in the very simplest terms, is that, you know, you can't, well, sort of, your past matters, your history, you can't change the past, you can, you know, and the way that the past is, as it were, constrains the options that you have for the future. So then there's a question of how did, so in a sense, the kinds of research that suggests, or the kinds of research questions it suggests, are how did educational policy in the EU evolve historically? Has its character changed over that time? Does it do its policies now look roughly similar to the way they used to be, or have they radically changed? And I think, in a sense, what one's pointing to there is the need for historical research on the EU to look at how, on the EU's lifelong learning policies and systems, to work out how far there is something different. And as you'll, I'm going to say more about that in a moment. There's the second area is I wanted to, or I saw myself drawing on this again. You can see this going back to what I said right at the beginning in terms of my interest in my PhD and so on. It's about organisation, so bureaucracy, and so on. Organisation, bureaucracy, the way, and the things that sociology has to say on that. And you can see that's related to theories of of soft governance. You know, the idea that that increasingly governance is being operated through mechanisms which pull different agencies within, or different institutions within society into line through measurement and so on. Rather than through bureaucratic organisation. And there's a particular theoretical approach in this area which has been pushed by a fellow called Martin Lawn, who he talks about the European educational space. And whilst I think that's got quite a lot, there are quite a lot of problems with that. It does point to the idea of thinking of the area of policy making and practice as a space in itself, which needs to be studied in terms of the internal power relationships and so on which exists. So the kinds of questions which seem to me that raised are how lifelong learning policies are shaped and implemented, and it calls for sociological research on the dynamics of policy formation and implementation. And the third one that came up that seemed to me to be interesting was the question of what international relations has to offer to the understanding of international organisations and the development of the EU. So how does the EU relate to its member states? And there's a large literature in international relations as a field about organisations like the UN and the ILO and the whatever they are, UNESCO and OECD, and how they relate to national governments and how policy making takes place within them, and so forth and so on. So one of the questions is how does the EU relate to its member state? What kind of organisation is it? How it's influenced by enlargement, and how lifelong learning falls into that. And I mean, it's a small point, but one of the things that came up there was it suggested to me historical comparisons with the processes of colonial administration in European empires. Anyway, so those were some theories and questions, and it pointed me towards what I'm going to do now is talk about three particular areas which I sort of think I looked at, or hope I looked at. Which relate to those. The first is this question of what were EU educational policies like in the past. So if we're going to that question of have we going to that question of how whether lifelong learning, the shape of lifelong learning in Europe is as we have it now, which is strongly economistic or fairly strongly economistic, whether that stems from this general trend to globalization and therefore can be explained in the same way that people like John Field explain the shift from the early phase of lifelong learning in the 1970s to with a more humanistic orientation to the more economistic one of the 1990s, or whether that explanation doesn't entirely work. And actually, if you look back into the policy literature from the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, you'll find that actually I can't spell education, can I?
Just a little stutter.
Yeah.
The King Street.
This economistic attitude towards education actually began in the 1950s, and it comes out of the fact that the European Union begins as the European Common Market, and its founding treaties and core institutions are all about setting up a free market within Europe. And that really drives, and still does, to a very large extent, the way in which the EU operates, the way we think about, the way lots of people think about the EU. You can see it in a lot of the debate in this country about the EU, where people are constantly saying, we weren't told it was going to be a political orientation, we were told that it was going to be, back in 1970 something, it was a common market. But that's also true of the European Union's institutions, where although there have been changes to the treaty and so on and so forth, which have broadened it, it remains fundamentally, in some sense, a common market, and its concern has been about competitiveness and responding to market needs. So when the EU took an economistic attitude to lifelong learning in the 1990s, and it certainly did, in common with most international organisations, where does that leave us? It doesn't make the standard explanation in terms of the spreading of neoliberalism wrong, but it does say, well, it's different, isn't it? And in fact, one of the things that I've begun to explore as a result of that is, in a sense, whether the re-emergence of lifelong learning in the 1990s was more possible for the EU simply because it had a more economistic orientation. In other words, it was very difficult for the EU to jump on the bandwagon of lifelong learning, to play an active part in it in the 1970s, when the international literature was much more humanistic. When it became much more economistic, it was possible for the EU to play part of that game. So that's my first question that I've raised. The second one, okay, yes. Well, despite having spent the last 3/4 of an hour telling you that European lifelong learning is really all about
the economy's stupid, right?
Is the economy stupid, competitiveness, and so on. That's not quite true, because actually, these things like since the early 1990s, when European lifelong learning began to be talked about, citizenship, social inclusion, social cohesion have been a key theme of European lifelong learning policy. European Union documents always talk about citizenship, about social inclusion, social cohesion. The language changes a bit, but it's always there. It's not there as the principal objective, but it's always there as one of the top 3 objectives, I would say. And how can we explain this? Well, and I guess my point about coming back to the question of theory, I guess this neoliberalism theory, and I'm putting a whole lot of I mean, anybody who is a sophisticated user of such theories will say that I'm using I'm putting an awful lot of complexity in one basket there, but it will say that actually these are residual categories, or possibly that citizenship is being used as a sort of camouflage for doing the dirty, doing the kind of the hard stuff. Well, that sort of there may be something in that. I'm not, but it seemed to me that we can also explain it partly through looking at if we think about it in terms of political and organisational sociology. So organisations, as I said earlier, they're contested sites for they're places in which contests take place. And if you look at the work, stemming from Weber 100 and something years ago, Weber's use of party, which is really about power in organisations, and a whole band of theorists later, and I tend to use Tom Burns and his work on the plurality of social systems, but there are many, many, many others. They bring out one of the things that shows, or it seems to me, it's possible on that basis that it's possible to argue that the way in which the growth of the Directorate General for Education, the bureaucratic growth of that since the late 1980s, and it's in the late 1980s that we find the formation of a Directorate General for Education, actually provides space for, yes, the development of policy on education from the point of view of competitiveness, lifelong learning from the point of view of competitiveness, but it also provides space for others within that organisation and within the European Union to press other objectives within education. So there is a bureaucratic space, as it were, or policy space within which people can press for these other objectives. And so no, they don't become dominant. No, they don't become the principal focus of European Union policy, but they sit there as parts of that policy. And how should we, so if we're trying, and then as I say in the bottom bullet point there, how should we try to look for evidence of that? Well, it seems to me we need to look far more at the processes of policy formation in the European Union. And actually, it's particularly in relation to lifelong learning, we know remarkably little about the processes of policy formation in lifelong learning, it seems to me. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier, that people will tend to look at what policy says and treat that as policy, not look at the process by which policy is developed and leads to those documents on the first part, and then the way in which those documents are carried through into the policies of the various different member states on the other. So then the third area I wanted to point to, a question I wanted to point to, is how policies are contested. And indeed, question, I suppose I must have put that how in brackets because I thought it was a sophisticated thing to say, but it's how are they contested, and indeed are they contested? Okay, so yes, well, you can. There's the kind of hollow laugh bit at the beginning, isn't there? The Lisbon Strategy. One of the things the Lisbon Strategy from 2000 was intended to do was to make the European Union the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, with more jobs and better social cohesion by 2010. Well, anyway, that was the objective, and with that, as I said earlier, went the open method of coordination, and education and training systems were to adapt to the demands of the knowledge society and the need for an improved level and quality of employment. But I suppose what I should really say is, firstly, in relation to the point I was making just now, greater social cohesion was clearly an objective of it. Better knowledge-based economy with greater social cohesion. With it went the open method of coordination, with all this stuff I've been mentioning earlier about timetables and goals and indicators and benchmarks and blah blah blah, monitoring of it and so on. From what I've called the neoliberalist view, this is very much this open method of coordination comes a technology of government, and the basic attitude to when people are writing about the open method of coordination, and the policy literature writes about it now a great deal. There's a remarkably large number of people studying the European Union. But I think one of the things that isn't really explored very much is in what ways and how successfully the open method of coordination has been used to promote wider non-economic aims. And so, I mean, I think it's, I suppose, I think it's right to say that the principal function of the OMC is to develop Europe as a more competitive economy, and so on, but it's not the only thing that it does. And one of the things that I've done in the last few years is to write an account of the process of developing indicators on active citizenship, which so that's that article which you can find. Okay, this is my last slide, and it's going back not to the questions of Europe, but to the question of theory, and really asking me to reflect on how theory seems to be useful or doesn't seem to be useful. And well, the first thing is a kind of get-out clause in a way. Theory comes in many shapes and sizes, and the kinds of theory I've talked about probably are quite different from the kinds of theory that you're interested in or you might be interested in, or indeed the kinds of way I've used theory probably doesn't it may well not make sense to you in terms of what you seem to be what seems to be theory from your point of view. But I suppose my feeling is that, having originated as a sociologist of sorts and come through social history into adult education, social theories really do have a lot to offer, because using social theories you actually see a lot of, they illuminate, as I say, their areas of reality in really interesting ways, and through using particular bits of theory you focus on and see things about society and the social world which you wouldn't have previously realised. But each particular theory, as it illuminates, I think it also conceals, or at least I've used them, cast shadows over areas of reality. So there are, different theories have different strengths and different limitations, and you don't always know what their strengths and limitations are before you start. I think the autobiographical bit at the beginning of what I said this afternoon it really comes into that third paragraph or third bullet point. What theories will help you depends in part on what you're interested in. You can't. Theories clearly don't have universal applicability. But I also think it works the other way around too, because I think you get into areas, you get interested in an area, you develop interest in you begin to look for theories that will interest you in that area, that will help you to understand that area. But then, having developed an interest in those theories, I think they also help you to they help to shape the areas you become interested in. So I think that things work that way. I think theories can be borrowed from other disciplines. In fact, I think is very much what we do most of the time, certainly in education. Education being a sort of fairly interdisciplinary sort of territory. But having said that, I think it is questionable whether education as a field borrows theories too unproblematically from other areas of social theory. And as it were, I think we are sometimes accused of using theories from other areas about 10 years after they've become, old hat in those other areas. But I won't go into that too much at this point. But and the final thing I wanted to say is that I think theory, however you want to say it, they actually become, in a personal sense, key element of one's intellectual capital. And I don't know. They pop up, in kind of surprising ways to illuminate things in areas where you're not expecting it. Now, I'll just give you one. I haven't done very much on this, but about 25 years ago, maybe even longer. Anyway, a long time ago, I did some work on adult education as an element of British colonial policy. And so I spent some time looking at British colonial policy, and one of the things that came up there was things like how colonial the relationships between the British government and its colonies, the way in which colonial administration took place, and the relationships between different levels within that, and so on. One of the elements of that was there was a very strong theory in the first half of the 20th century, which was called indirect rule. It was a theory of colonial government, I suppose, and it basically said in the British colonial empire, we'll run things a lot better if we work through and try to use the local governments rather than as it were try to impose rule directly. Well, I mean, it seemed to me that at least it's not quite fair to call that a sort of academic theory, but it's certainly a theory of rule, and a theory of colonial rule, and it seemed to me quite interesting as a sort of analogy or metaphor for some of the ways in which the European Union relates to its member states. There are differences, but there are similarities, and it's one of the things that one can begin to think through. Right. At which point I'll bring it to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. Well, we have plenty of time for comments and questions now. Do you have questions, comments?
I have a couple. My name's Jeannie, I'm from the business school. And I think my question will disclose why I'm here, really. So I've got two questions, John, if I may. It's around that first. I'm going to challenge you on the path dependency thing, because it's not a hard challenge. It's just and it leaves an extra question. Then I think you were talking about this sort of interregnum between when the EU was formed, or rather, I think there is an interregnum between when the EU was formed and the 90s. Because what you describe as a sort of neoliberal origin of the EU was there. So the thinkers that are behind, certainly the economists that are behind the neoliberal agenda, were all writing in if my memory serves, from 1921 through to the 50s. So Kerzner, Hayek, Schumpeter, and others, all the people. So I think the interesting question there is what happened in between the EU being formed and the neoliberal agenda speeding up in the 90s, which I totally accept. And I've noted down sort of a kind of Keynesian contract that we all had, where we all, was Heath social democrat, was he really a social democrat? And the theory that was going around in my mind was, well, the difference between the 50s and the 90s was the place of capital because of the deregulation of the city. And Britain only joined the EU in the 70s. We're only seriously engaged probably in the beginning of the Thatcher government. So I think that's got something to do with it. So I'm saying, I agree with your path dependency argument, but I think the interesting bit is what was missing in between. So that was one question. Can I have a second one? Then
yes.
I get it out?
What I've lost is my pencil,
Okay.
which I need to find in order to.
Yeah.
I can repeat it because it's history and I'm very comfortable with history.
Let's hear.
So I think there's something around that as a question, because what strikes me in your presentation is there's about 6 or 7 PhD projects in there, I think. So I'm just going to throw another one in. The second thing, which is closer to what I'm considering at the moment, which is what happens at the organisational level. A lot of what you're describing is what I might consider a macro level thing, but what I'm struggling with at the moment, interestingly, is competing institutional logics in, well, as it turns out, in the university, and how various groups within the university make claims to different institutional logics to justify, legitimise their risk-taking. So that's where it gets into the business schools. That's corporate entrepreneurship, proactivity, risk-taking. And I think there's something in that for what you're talking about too, because whilst you do have this neoliberal agenda, there's a lot of things that have gone on in what you've described as lifelong learning that don't seem to be fully engaged with that agenda. And I think what happens in organisations, maybe in governments, but certainly in organisations, is these institutional logics which are essentially competing, because the neoliberal one is particularly virulent. I can't even get the word out, but they do accommodate. They are accommodated. You know, isn't it an either or? And there's some very recent research within the business arena around how competing logics are form a bridge and produce a new logic, or actually just simply coexist, and groups legitimise what they do by calling from different logics. So I just wanted to share my latest bit of research. But the question is, so I think there's something in institutional theory that could be brought to the picture, but my question is about this interregnum, which is your first bit, which is around maybe what actually happened.
Yeah. Right. Well, on the interregnum bit, I have, of course, excluded or not mentioned all the other people who have argued differently. If I can just, and one, I mean, firstly, there is, I think there is. Firstly, I've cast that difference between the 70s and the 90s probably more sharply than it really is. I've said humanitarian, cuddly 70s. Thatcherite, nasty Reaganite 90s, and it's not as simple as that by any means. And I use that quotation from Boscher about HRD and drag. It's that's the really sharp way of distinguishing the two, and but there's a lot of the neoliberal stuff, or at least the competitiveness and economic development stuff in the 1970s, there's just more of the humanitarian cuddly stuff as well, if I can put it that way. In relation to what happens to the neoliberal, well, I mean, you know, in a sense, I think yes, it's perfectly true that that stuff originates in the 30s and 40s, and it becomes really powerful. Well, sorry, it begins to worm its way through the policy into the sort of policy world in the 60s and 70s. I mean, I can certainly remember doing a degree in economics, or part of a degree in economics in the early 1970s, and we read Friedman, but we thought he was crackers. It was obvious that he was crackers. Well, actually, it still is obvious that he's crackers, but you know, it is just that his ideas rule the world now. But then through the 70s, certainly you see these things. I mean, I can remember. It shows the way the world's changed. I remember buying in the late 1970s, about 78 or 79, I think it was, a pamphlet by John Redwood, whom you called something like "Value for Money Audits in Nationalised Industries," and I read this and thought this was completely balmy. You know, again, and it's not only that I thought it was balmy; it just was way, way, way out of the political mainstream of the time. But it now looks kind of totally reasonable, and you know, we all accept it. So, well, okay,
good hearts law.
Okay, yes, yeah, but anyway, yes, I think it's right that and I think it's right that if you looked at the origins of the EU, there's a lot of you know, it's built around the free market.
Well, it's the creative destruction of the Second World War.
Yes, yeah. But what you
looking at it, not the one I promote, but it was a political settlement around you know, never again, and the role of Germany and rehabilitating Germany. But it was also an economic settlement too.
And what you get in it clearly is sorry, and I think this brings us on to your second point. I mean, I think it brings us on. You clearly also get within the common market, the European community, and whatever it was at that stage, you get this arising of different approaches, and so by the time we get to the 80s or whatever, you know, it's what looks different about the EU in many ways is the European social model, and you know, what are the social partners, and you know, involvement of social partners in everything, and so it's a much more sort of collectivist approach to the economy and to society than we have now, and that is so. I think one of the things you get within that is exactly your point about competing logics within institutions, within organisations. I think that's absolutely right. You get the question which seems to me really interesting is where those logics actually come from and how they're sustained within those organisations. So.
Legitimacy claims. The corporate entrepreneurship literature would talk about legitimacy claims, as would the institutional theory.
Right. But where does the legitimacy come from? That's you know, I mean, there's one line which says, you know, well, I don't know. One approach would be that this sort of naturally arises out of human collective endeavour, but therefore there is necessarily claims about solidarity and stuff like that which inevitably arise, and you'd find that somewhere in the sort of sociological literature, I should think, and I suppose that's the kind of position which I would kind of instinctively adhere to. but it's not obvious that why that should be the case.
Sorry. Yes.
I've got two questions as well. The one is fairly straightforward, and I'd like to make it the second one, as it were, and that is how do you assess how much lifelong learning is taking place in a country when
This is the second one, but you're asking it first.
yes, because the other one's more complicated.
He is a mathematician, so
Particularly, the internet has not had a huge effect in schools, but presumably it's had a huge effect in lifelong learning and so on and so forth. So that's a straightforward question. It may not be easy to answer, but the other is at a higher level, and that's to talk about the roles of theory. I'm a physicist, actually.
right.
Mathematical physicist, but a physicist nonetheless. So I come from an empirical field, and what you call theories, or what we call theories in social science, physicists would call effects. That is, people argue as though they are, it's one or the other. Constructivism and behaviorism, they sort of have these fights. They're both right in some sense, but neither of them is a complete theory of anything. And I have a favourite physical example which everybody's familiar with who's ever looked at a weather map. There's a physical effect that air will move from a region of high pressure to a region of lower pressure. So if you blow up a balloon and let it goes right? So if you think about that carefully in terms of the atmosphere, the high pressure areas, and there are low pressure areas, highs and lows on the map, and the air should flow downhill across the isobars, perpendicular to the isobars from one to the other. They should sort of even out. It doesn't. It flows where we are nearer parallel to the isobars because there's another effect which is harder to understand, but it comes because the Earth is spinning. It's a gyroscopic effect. So what's the relevance of this to what you've been talking about? Well, all the viewpoints you've given seem to me to be, in some sense, true. We see it now in arguments about the current government's policies on the economy. It's true that if you get more in through taxes and you spend less, the deficit will go down. Except there's another effect, which is the whole system will go down because of lack of growth. And the interesting thing is how these things trade off. The Labour Party is claiming you'll actually make the deficit worse, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, these are not exact sciences, what sciences are, but things are much harder in education or in economics or in what you've been talking about. And the bigger the system, the harder what I'm going to suggest becomes. So how do you find out where the balance is? I've never heard a meeting that talked about educational objectives where both the humanistic and the economistic arguments were not put forward. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but I never have. The balance has shifted. When I did my limited amount of extramural teaching many years ago, it was lecturing on relativity to 12 people in Wolverhampton on a Tuesday night. And it was entirely a humanistic activity of the department concerned. What economistic stuff would have been called training, I think, in those days. The balance has shifted, partly because people don't want to pay for that anymore. But there is this issue. Now, in education, where you have these competing theories, our perspective in the centre I'm involved with for many years is that the only way you can find out these theories, how they balance out, is by being more modest about how good the theories are, and by doing what we would call design research. That is, you build an experiment on whatever your system you're interested in. It's a lot easier in the classroom than it is with a school system, let alone with an international organisation. But you essentially have initiatives where the principles behind them are clearly set out, and the theoretical things that are the pressures are clearly set out, and you monitor them, you instrument them in some way to find out what happens and how these things balance away. And from this you get something of what's essential in any theory that's used as a basis for design but rarely exists in social science, which is an idea of the range of validity of a theory. When you pull a piece of metal, how much it stretches is proportional to how hard you pull it, till you pull it too hard when it breaks. So design research allows you to use theory as an input. The details matter as well, and learn more as you go along, both about the theories and have tools that are of practical use if the stuff works out well. So I've ranged a fair way from your talk towards design research, but it's a journey I'm sure you've taken yourself, and love your comments on it.
Right. Well, I won't. Taking the second point first, which may be the first point second.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that the role of I'll really just I think make this point. I think there's. I mean, clearly we use theory in a really large number of ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's lots of different ways in which we use the term, and that's true in education, perhaps more than in an area like sociology, for example, because we're interested in theories that work in practice, that can be, as it were, made operational and lead to certain things getting better or changing, as opposed to simply understanding. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that my orientation to theory is a lot more in terms of let's use it as a mechanism of understanding what's going on than as something which we can use in order to, as it were, plug into change,
to
plan for. Yes. So I don't. So that's one sort of distinction, and there's a second distinction which I think is kind of related but not quite the same, which is between a theory as a sort of an analytical thing and a theory as a normative thing. You know, I mean, there clearly are. Well, if I take my neoliberal thing, for example, there are people who use neoliberal theory as something which is normatively great. There are others who use it as something which is normatively abhorrent.
Some people don't know they're using it.
And some people, they don't know they're using it. And indeed, so there's but there's also, it's also possible, I think, to use it in various ways analytically. And I think if you come back to your points about, for example, institutional economics and so on, you can use that quite interestingly, even if you actually find some of its kind of content fairly unpleasant. So that's which isn't really an answer to your question overall.
It's a comment on the comment.
Yeah. As to how you measure lifelong learning in a country, well, that's very interesting. And actually, I'm doing a paper at a conference which was on the campus here next week, which you must come. No, next month rather, which you must come to. But you'll have to pay the fee, of course.
Not pay the fee, do you fee in euros?
Which is around this, because although it's you say, how can you assess the amount of lifelong learning in a country? Well, the answer to the European Union has a way of doing that.
Sure.
And the EU it has indicators on a whole range of things. It went through a process which, you know, in a sense, could have been the topic of this seminar, but wasn't. Which was from around 2003. It went through a process of what it called indicator development, and it developed indicators for about I think it was about 26 different areas within education. Lots of things in other areas as well. And the one that it came up with one in relation to lifelong learning. Now, the process of indicator development roughly speaking, it had two things. Firstly, it had to be relatively cost effective. So you couldn't, develop an indicator which was going to cost you a vast amount of money. And it had to have some degree of reliability. Or I think they might put it rather more strongly than that. It had to be robust and something or other. Reliable. I can't remember the terminology, but something like that. Well, the one that they came up with in relation to lifelong learning was drawn out of the EU's labour force survey, which is a survey of the labour force, conducted at least every year, and in most cases every 3 months in every member state. And it's what, for example, a lot of the data that's used in this country about unemployment and employment and blah 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 is drawn from. One of the there are questions in this about have you been involved in any education or training in the last 3 months or something? I can't remember, something like that. And this is asked across all countries, and what they have done, what they do is click into that. So the measure, the European Lifelong Learning Participation Index, is actually a measure of, I think, the number of, or the proportion of the population in each country which has been involved in education or training of at least such and such a length during the period of previous 3 months or something, of people aged between 25 and 64.
Is that only in formal settings, or is it?
Well, now we come to some very interesting things. If you actually, however, dig a bit deeper and look at the question, I'm doing a paper I'm going to be doing next week. If you dig a bit deeper and look at the question which is actually asked in the different countries, you'll find that although technically the same, it actually is significantly different. So in some countries they will give, for example, they will talk about, they'll use phrases like within or outside the regular education system, or not within the regular, I forget the exact terminology.
Yeah.
In some countries they will they will give examples. So they'll say, have you been involved in any education such as blah 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 blah, and those examples vary and are broader or narrower in different countries. And surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, and this is my argument anyway, there is a connection, or there seems to be an association, let's put it that way, between the way in which the questions are posed and the proportion of people within that country who are participating in lifelong learning. And what then becomes quite interesting is, of course, that in the process of indicators, the European Union, the European Commission, publishes every year a report on the progress of the different countries against the targets and indicators. And in one particular year, about 2 or 3 years ago, it produced a list of high performers and low performers. So some people, and they use a traffic light system. So the green ones were high performers, and the red ones were the bad performers, and there was ones in the middle. But yet it seemed to, well, I mean, my argument at least is that
have they changed the question between one year and the other?
Well, no, it's not they changed the question. It's that the countries with the high performance ask the broader question, the question which defines education.
I thought you said it was a value-added measure.
No. It's a question of the degree of
the level of
the amount of participation they have had. So that's I mean on the one hand, the European Union would accept that this is that there is a rough and ready element to these, that and they would certainly accept all the normal arguments about measures. It doesn't measure everything. For example, it doesn't measure learning of people over the age of 65. It doesn't measure the learning of people under the age of 25, and so on. But it prefers to. Nevertheless, it still treats it as though it's quite a finely graded. You can draw some quite finely graded distinctions between countries.
Does anybody care? I mean, do governments care?
I think so. I think they do. Yes. I mean, that's a fair question.
Because once people start to care, they start gaming the system.
Well, I think
and,
it probably
Woodhart
matters in quite a lot in some countries. I mean, if you think of the politics of the EU, it's really quite varied. I mean, there are countries like the UK, for example, which basically don't like to think that they are involved in the UK in the EU and would never. But you know, in one sense, the UK is in European terms a big country. You know, as is Germany, as is France, and so on to others. But then there's a whole myriad of countries which are really quite small in population, and very often are more recent members, and where the power of the European Union over them, the extent to which they have to align themselves with policy is much more marked.
Yeah.
So in some countries it is quite important.
Yes, we have.
Just a follow-up to his first question that became your second response. How did the UK fare in that evaluation of the different countries? Yeah.
Oh, it did.
And in the second question, that's what I can. Have studies been done to show correlation between the countries that do very well in the lifelong learning and economic development, since it seems to be economically tied?
Yeah. Okay. That's. I'm sorry. The first bit of your question was
How did the UK fare?
Oh, okay. Pretty well, actually. Pretty well. It's broadly speaking, the northern countries of Europe do pretty well. Sweden is up there at the top. The UK is pretty high, and so on. And the eastern and southern countries do less well. I mean, that's a bit simplistic, but it's broadly right. As to your second question, which I've now forgotten. Sorry, the second.
Studies have been done to show correlation.
Oh yes. Well, there. Sorry,
Does it pay off in economic terms?
Oh, right. Okay. No, it's not even that. Is it? It's that there is a strong correlation between economic development and participation in lifelong learning, but it's not necessarily the causation is not necessarily the obvious way round. I mean, broadly speaking, it would appear that I think I'm right in saying that it would appear that the more developed your country, the more participation you will tend to have in lifelong learning.
Could be industrial structure.
But then these are driven by a whole lot of other things. For example, we know that, I mean, it's sort of pretty much universally true that the better educated you are, the more you will take part in lifelong learning. So the higher your level of of educational system development, other things being equal, the higher will be your participation in lifelong learning. There are things that count against that. For example, the question of the labour market in the particular country. One of the things that we've had in the last 20 years, for example, in Europe, has been the way in which these extremely highly educated countries of the post-Soviet or the ex-Soviet bloc have had, as it were, economies which are completely out of kilter with their level of educational development, and in a sense that hasn't. So the normal patterns don't apply in relation to Eastern Europe.
It must be industrial structure as well, John.
Yeah, it must be the industrial structure too. What we find is that the labour market in particular has a really powerful impact on it.
Well, my Hungarian friends who do 3 jobs to stay alive
Exactly.
don't have much time for training.
No, exactly.
And also maybe the existence of formal institutions. No, I'm thinking like in more industrial societies, they also count with a more formal education that is under the label of lifelong learning. No, other ones they do have lifelong learning, but it is informally going on. So you have to fit.
I mean, there's a whole battery of things which are. It's argued increase participation in lifelong learning, and I think it probably do, which is for things like all these things like qualifications frameworks and your systems for recognising informal and non-formal learning, and all these things play a part in it, and clearly that's stuff which the EU is trying to, as they say, drive forward.
They could design an app
They
for your computer to measure your internet-based lifelong learning.
How much learning have you done today?
Yes.
I think we have run out of time. I don't know if there is one quick question or. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.